Hello, dear. I'm Grandma Ruth, and I have to tell you, salmon is one of those foods that seems to trip more people up than almost anything else in the kitchen. And I say that having ruined my fair share of it myself over the years before I ever learned any better. I've watched more than one good piece of fish, expensive too, mind you, the kind of thing you buy for a special Sunday supper rather than an ordinary Tuesday, end up dry, rubbery, and falling apart into sad little flakes on somebody's plate, everyone at the table politely eating around the driest bits and saying nothing at all about it. And every single time, it comes down to the very same handful of mistakes, the sort of mistakes I made myself for years before an old fisherman's wife up the coast finally set me straight one summer while I was visiting my sister, standing right there in her little kitchen that smelled like salt air and wood smoke. A kitchen unlike any I'd cooked in before or since. Today, I want to walk you through exactly where most folks go wrong with their salmon. The small errors that seem harmless enough in the moment but add up to a disappointing supper every single time. And then I'm going to show you the old-fashioned method that's never once failed me since. The one that gets you a piece of fish with skin crackling like autumn leaves underfoot and flesh so tender it barely needs a fork to fall apart. Stick with me clear through to the end, because I've got a few extra bits of wisdom about doneness, seasoning, and leftovers that I think you'll find just as useful as the main trick itself. Let's start with where things go wrong, because until you understand the mistake, the fix won't mean nearly as much to you. It'll just sound like an extra step somebody's asking you to bother with for no good reason. One more thing standing between you and supper on a busy evening. The very first thing nearly everybody does wrong is pulling that salmon straight from the refrigerator and dropping it directly into a hot pan, cold clear through to the center, the way you might with a piece of chicken you're in a hurry to get cooking. A piece of fish that's still icy in the middle cooks unevenly from the very first second it hits the heat, the outside racing ahead while the inside lags stubbornly behind, and by the time that center finally catches up to where it needs to be, the outside has usually gone well past done and turned tough, dry, and disappointing. The very texture nobody wants on their plate. Let your salmon sit out on the counter for a good 15 to 20 minutes before it ever sees a pan. Just enough to take the chill off without letting it sit out so long it becomes any kind of concern, and you'll already be a good deal ahead of most home cooks before you've done a single other thing differently. The second mistake, and I see this one constantly, is not drying the fish properly before it goes into the pan. Treating it as though a quick rinse under the tap is all the preparation it needs. A piece of salmon fresh out of its packaging or fresh off a fillet you've just rinsed under the tap carries a good bit of surface moisture sitting right there on the skin and the flesh, more than you'd think just looking at it. Drop that damp fish into hot oil, and instead of getting a proper sear, you get a burst of angry hissing and spatter, oil jumping clean out of the pan, and that steam rising up off the wet surface keeps the fish from ever browning properly, no matter how long you leave it sitting in the pan, hoping for that golden color to show up eventually. Pat your salmon dry with a paper towel, pressing gently but firmly across both the skin and the flesh side, going over it 2 or 3 times if you need to, until there's no shine of moisture left anywhere on the surface. And you'll notice the difference the very moment it hits the oil, that satisfying quiet sizzle instead of a violent spatter. The third mistake is flipping and fussing with the fish far too much once it's finally in the pan, treating it more like scrambled eggs that need constant attention than a piece of fish that wants to be left mostly alone. I understand the temptation standing there watching it cook, wanting to peek underneath and see how things are coming along, nudging it this way and that with your spatula every 30 seconds, just to reassure yourself it hasn't stuck or scorched. But every time you move that fish before it's ready, you tear away whatever crust has only just started to form underneath, and you lose your best chance at that crackling golden skin everybody's after, the very thing that separates a good piece of salmon from a truly memorable one. Salmon needs to be left alone to do its work, undisturbed for the great majority of its cooking time, trusting the process even when every instinct in you wants to check underneath one more time, the same patience it takes to let a good stew simmer without lifting the lid every few minutes, and I'll walk you through exactly how long that ought to be in just a moment. And the fourth mistake, the one that ruins more suppers than any other, is cooking salmon straight through until it's opaque and firm all the way to the very center. The way you might cook a chicken breast, checked and rechecked until every last trace of pink has vanished entirely from sight. Salmon isn't chicken, and it doesn't want to be treated like chicken, no matter how deeply ingrained that habit of cooking meat until it's fully white and firm might be after a lifetime of cooking poultry that way for safety's sake. Cooked all the way through like that, salmon turns dry, chalky, and loses nearly all of the rich, buttery quality that makes it worth cooking in the first place, worth the extra money it costs at the counter over a plainer cut of fish. The very best salmon is pulled from the heat, while the very center is still a touch translucent, just barely, a soft, rosy blush rather than a stark, uniform pink throughout, since it will keep cooking a little more from its own residual heat once it's off the pan, finishing up perfectly by the time it reaches your fork. I remember the exact moment that fisherman's wife pulled her own salmon out of the pan that afternoon, setting it down on a plate without a word, and I remember thinking to myself that it looked entirely too pale in the middle, certain she'd forgotten it on the stove or lost track of the time while we were talking. I very nearly said something, being the sort of young woman back then who thought she already knew a fair bit about cooking a piece of fish. She just smiled at me the way my own grandmother used to smile whenever I was about to learn something the hard way, and told me to wait and taste it before I said another word. I did, and I've never doubted her since, not once in all the years that followed. That first bite was unlike any salmon I'd ever put in my mouth before, rich and soft and practically melting. Nothing at all like the dry, overcooked pieces I'd been serving my own family for years without knowing any better. And I remember sitting there at her little table asking her to show me every single step over again, twice through, so I'd be certain to remember it properly once I got back home to my own kitchen. Now, here's the old-fashioned secret, the one that fisherman's wife showed me all those years ago, standing over her own stove with a pan that looked like it had cooked 10,000 suppers before mine ever touched it, black and well-seasoned from decades of use, nothing fancy or new about it in the slightest. The trick is this. You start your salmon skin side down in a pan that isn't fully hot yet, just barely warm with a touch of oil in the bottom, and you let the fish and the pan heat up together gradually, rather than dropping cold fish into a screaming hot pan the way most recipes tell you to do, all in a rush to sear it as fast as possible. This slow, gradual heat gives the fat sitting just beneath that skin all the time it needs to render out nice and slow, melting away bit by bit instead of seizing up all at once the way it does, under a sudden blast of high heat, and that slow rendering is exactly what gives you skin so crisp it shatters at the touch of a fork, without ever scorching the delicate flesh sitting just above it. It sounds almost backward, starting a pan cold when everything else you've ever read about searing tells you to get your pan good and hot first, but that's precisely why so few people ever discover it on their own, and precisely why it works so well once you finally give it a try. Let me walk you through the whole process from the very start so you can follow along step by step. Next time you've got a piece of salmon waiting in your kitchen, no need to write anything down, since once you've done it a time or two, it'll become second nature to you, the same way it long ago became second nature to me. Begin with your fillet dried thoroughly, as I mentioned, and season it simply, just a good pinch of salt and a few turns of pepper on both sides. Nothing fancy needed to get in the way of that good rich flavor the fish already brings to the table on its own. Set a heavy skillet, cast iron does beautifully here, or a good heavy-bottom stainless pan if that's what you've got on hand, since the weight of the pan itself helps hold and spread that gentle heat evenly across the whole surface rather than letting hot spots form underneath the thinner parts of the fillet over medium-low heat. And add just a thin film of a neutral oil, something like a light olive oil or a plain vegetable oil, nothing with a strong flavor of its own to compete with the fish. Lay your salmon into that pan skin side down while the pan is still gently warming, not screaming hot the way you might expect from everything else you've ever read about searing meat, and press down lightly on the fillet with the back of a spatula for the first 10 or 15 seconds, just enough pressure to keep that skin flat against the metal instead of curling up and away from the heat, which it will absolutely try to do if you let it, pulling itself into an unsightly little arch right there in the pan. Now leave it be, truly leave it alone, resisting every urge to lift the edge and peek underneath, no matter how strong that urge grows as the minutes tick by and the smell starts filling your kitchen. Let that fish sit there, skin side down, for a good 6 to 8 minutes, depending on the thickness of your fillet, while the pan and the fish slowly climb in temperature together, working as one instead of fighting each other the way a cold fillet fights against a scorching hot pan. You'll start to see the flesh along the sides turning from that raw, translucent pink to a paler, more opaque color, climbing up from the bottom toward the top, almost like a tide coming in slowly along a shoreline. And that's your sign the heat is working its way through from the skin side just the way it should, gently and evenly rather than in one harsh rush. When the color has climbed about 3/4 of the way up the side of the fillet, and not a moment before, it's time to flip, and you'll want to have your spatula ready and waiting, so you can move quickly and confidently once that moment finally arrives. Turn the fish over gently with a thin spatula, sliding it fully underneath in one confident motion, rather than stabbing and prodding at it flesh side down now, and give it just a minute or two more. No longer, just enough to finish off that top surface without pushing the center past where you want it to land. This is the moment for the last little touch if you'd like it, and I always do. A small pat of butter dropped right into the pan alongside the fish, tilted just slightly so the butter pools to one side, and a spoon or two basted over the top of the fillet as it finishes, along with a smashed clove of garlic and a sprig of fresh thyme or rosemary, if you happen to have some on hand growing in a pot on the windowsill, the way I always try to keep. That basting butter carries flavor down into the fish in those last moments of cooking, seeping into every little flake, and it's the difference between a good piece of salmon and a genuinely memorable one, the kind folks ask you about for weeks afterward. I ought to say a word here about the skin itself, since I know a good many folks peel it away and toss it before they ever start cooking, missing out entirely on what it has to offer. That skin isn't just something to be removed and discarded. It's doing real work throughout this whole process, protecting the delicate flesh above it from the direct heat of the pan while it renders its own fat down slow and steady. And once it's crisped up properly the way we've just walked through, it turns into one of the very best parts of the whole dish, crackling and rich in a way that surprises folks who've never once thought to eat it before. Even if you'd rather not eat the skin yourself, once it's cooked, cooking with it left on still protects that flesh underneath a good deal better than cooking a skinless fillet ever will. So, I'd encourage you to leave it be right through to the very end, whatever you decide to do with it once it lands on your plate, whether that's savoring every last crisp bite or setting it politely to one side for somebody else at the table who's learned to appreciate it the way I have over all these years. Pull the fish from the pan the moment that flesh side has just barely finished, while the very center still shows a touch of that deeper pink translucence when you peek at it with the tip of a knife right at the thickest part. Set it on a warm plate and let it rest for a full 3 to 5 minutes before anybody cuts into it, resisting the urge to serve it the very second it leaves the pan, no matter how impatient the table's grown, waiting for supper. I know that's a hard wait when the smell coming off that pan is filling up your whole kitchen and everybody's already reaching for their forks. But that resting time lets the fish finish cooking gently from its own carried over heat and lets the juices settle back through the flesh, the very same principle as a good roast, just on a much smaller scale and over a much shorter time, a matter of minutes rather than a good long while. Now, how do you know for certain your salmon has reached the right point without cutting the whole fillet open right there at the stove and ruining the presentation before it ever reaches the table? The old-fashioned way, the way I was taught long before instant read thermometers ever sat in every kitchen drawer, as a matter of course, is to press gently on the thickest part of the fillet with your fingertip, feeling for how it responds under that light pressure. If it feels soft and gives way easily, almost jiggly, the way raw fish does, it needs more time yet. If it flakes apart readily under gentle pressure but still holds together in soft, moist layers rather than falling into dry, separate shreds that crumble away from each other, it's exactly where you want it to be. And if you've got a thermometer handy and would rather have a number to go by instead of trusting your own fingertip, 125 degrees Fahrenheit right in the thickest part is where I pull mine from the heat every single time, knowing it'll climb another 5 degrees or so while it rests on that warm plate, landing right around a perfect 130 tender and just barely translucent at the very center. Exactly the way it ought to be. A small enough window that it's worth checking a minute or two before you think you're ready, rather than guessing and hoping for the best. I want to say a word, too, about choosing your salmon in the first place, since even the very best technique in the world won't save a poor piece of fish that had no business coming home with you in the first place. Look for flesh that's firm to the touch and springs back rather than leaving a dent when you press it gently with a fingertip, with a good even color throughout rather than any dull or grayish patches that suggest it's been sitting a good deal longer than it should have. Fresh salmon should smell clean, like the sea itself, never sharp or overly fishy in a way that catches you off guard the moment you lift the lid off the package. And if you're buying a fillet with the skin still attached, which I'd always recommend if you can manage it, since that skin is doing important work in this whole technique, make sure that skin looks bright and unblemished without any tears or ragged edges where it's begun pulling away from the flesh underneath. A thicker cut of fillet, taken from closer to the head end of the fish rather than the thin tail portion, cooks more evenly and gives you a better chance at that perfect, barely translucent center we've been talking about this whole while, since a thin tail piece will always finish cooking faster than the thicker end, leaving you with an uneven result no matter how carefully you watch the clock or how faithfully you follow every other step we've gone through together today. As for what to serve alongside it, my own family has always favored something simple that doesn't fight with the richness of the fish itself, letting the salmon stay the true star of the plate rather than getting lost among too many competing flavors. A squeeze of fresh lemon right at the table brightens everything up beautifully, cutting through that richness in exactly the way it needs, and a plain green vegetable asparagus or green beans given a quick turn in the same buttery pan. Once the salmon's come out, picks up every last bit of that flavor left behind rather than letting it go to waste sitting there in the pan. I like to serve mine over a bed of simple rice or alongside a good crusty piece of bread, just enough to soak up whatever butter's left pooling on the plate, because I promise you, nobody at my table has ever let that go to waste, mopping up every last bit with the corner of a torn piece of bread. A simple salad with a light vinegar dressing does nicely too, on a warmer evening when a heavier side feels like too much alongside such a rich piece of fish, something crisp and cool to balance out all that warmth and richness coming off the plate. And if you happen to have a bit of salmon left over from the night before, don't let it go stale sitting in the refrigerator wrapped in nothing but a loose bit of foil that lets it dry out overnight. Flake it apart gently with a fork the next morning and fold it into scrambled eggs for a rich, savory breakfast that feels like a good deal more effort than it actually took. Or flake it cold into a simple salad with a bit of mayonnaise, a squeeze of lemon, and some chopped celery for a salmon salad that makes a fine lunch on a warm afternoon. Spread over a piece of good bread or spooned over a bed of lettuce straight from the garden. Cooked salmon done properly the first time around is just as good, sometimes even better, the second day once all that flavor has had a bit of extra time to settle in and mingle together. And I've never once considered it a lesser meal just because it started out as leftovers from the evening before. A fine lunch in its own right rather than something to feel apologetic about serving. So there you have it, the very reason 99 folks out of 100 end up disappointed with their salmon, standing over a dry, chalky piece of fish wondering where they went wrong when they followed every instruction to the letter, and the old-fashioned secret that's kept mine turning out perfectly for more years than I can count, ever since that summer afternoon in my sister's kitchen. Dry your fish, let it come to room temperature first, start it in a gently warming pan skin, side down, and leave it be, no matter how tempting it is to peek, and pull it while the center still holds just a touch of that beautiful translucent pink, rather than cooking it through the way you might any other cut of meat. Do that, and I promise you, you'll never again wonder why the salmon at a good restaurant always seems to taste so much better than the salmon you make at home, because from here on out, yours will taste every bit as good, right there at your own table without a single dollar spent going out for supper. It took me the better part of a summer visiting my sister to finally understand what that fisherman's wife had been trying to tell me the whole while, and I've been passing that same lesson along to anyone who'll stand still long enough to listen ever since, my own children and grandchildren included, every last one of them cooking their salmon this exact same way now whenever they've got a fillet waiting in their own kitchen. I'd love to hear how yours turns out if you give this a try this week. So come back and tell me down in the comments. And let me know, too, if there's another fish or another cut of meat you'd like me to walk through the very same way in a future video, since I've got a good many more of these old-fashioned tricks tucked away that I'd be glad to share with you. I'm Grandma Ruth. Thank you for listening to Grandma Knows Best.